Finally, we're here. We're finally ready to create the living document that is a contingency plan. Now let's just all get on the same page. Let's just reiterate the key points from previous sections so we can get started. The planning process is more important than the plan. What the heck does that mean? Well, writing the plan is all about assembling the new knowledge through teamwork and putting into a document that will constitute your plan. The majority of the work is done once you get to this point. From Section 2, Partners in Response, you should have identified who your various partners are, identified what resources they bring to the table. You should have created a working relationship with them and possibly signed a memorandum of understanding or other contract with some of them. Now you should be ready to write them into your facility-specific plan and request that your partners write you into their plans. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of this relationship. It should be the beginning of continued joint meetings, training events, and possibly respond together in the event of a disaster. Write your plan based on the disaster events you anticipate, using the resources you already have, defining the resources you still need but plan to acquire, and within the limits of your capability and control. This is what brings you here. You know who your partners are and for what you are preparing, and with what you have to do it. Keeping in mind the major objectives of incident management, as part of property protection, we must define specific individual or particular animal groups of the highest institutional value or the most susceptible in a disaster. Captive wildlife may be valuable for numerous reasons beyond purely financial. First, the critical decision of which animals are to be protected must be based on your unique collection composition. Of course, the conservation value of endangered and threatened species has inherent genetic value. But also, institutional ambassador animals may be important for public relations, such as education animals or institutional mascots. Second, the disaster type may dictate the species at greatest risk. California condors may be at risk with the Newcastle disease outbreak, but the water buffalo will not be affected. Tropical species in a winter storm disaster, or cold water species in a heat wave. These may be singled out as the most vulnerable if these threats exist for your facility collection. Regardless of criteria, these should be clearly identified in your plan to ensure appropriate sheltering on site or evacuation of those priority animals. Make it simple by breaking the plan down into digestible parts. If an objective is still complicated or overwhelming, break it down further until the components can be identified and then can be individually accomplished. Make it measurable by defining the logistics as closely as possible, and define the resources required and how success can be measured for each step. Be sure that your staff and your partners can actually accomplish the objectives within their capability, because it must be achievable. Even if an objective is achievable, is it reasonable for you? Is it within your budget, given the other facility financial priorities? Will it allow continuity of business? Define when each step should be accomplished. Without deadlines, no one would study for final exams. Timelines are made to be changed, but if we don't establish a chronological goal for the objectives, progress is difficult to evaluate. Your partners are your primary subject matter experts. With their input, you can decide what form and direction a plan will take. You don't need really to complicate the plan more than necessary. Just make it flexible and scalable. For example, when you're preparing for the storm rider team to shelter in place, it needs to be flexible enough to work in a flood or ice storm or high winds, with only moderate plan accommodations or modifications based on the disaster type. The storm rider team sheltering also needs to be scalable to accomplish just a 72-hour autonomous function, or to expand to a long-term recovery period if the local infrastructure is inoperative for a month, as it was in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Likewise, with infectious disease outbreaks, Your routine biosecurity limits disease spread within your facility every day, but it must be scalable to accommodate a more serious or long-term biosecure operations. For example, during avian flu or foot and mouth agricultural disease outbreak in the surrounding farmland. For example, your standard biosecurity operating procedures might be expanded to better decontaminate staff boots, or to include protective apparel like use of disposable shoe covers, or increased use of personal protective equipment like gloves or masks. In other words, make it scalable to the level determined by the event and the severity. Understanding how your local partners organize their response plan will give you an advantage. You need to know how they organize their response and for what they are prepared. This can guide you to the best means of integration with your partners. Many of your partners use the ICS system to organize their people, but how do they put together their written plan? You can use the parts you find the most applicable and ignore those which may not be appropriate for animal facilities or your facility. Of course, some of their plan won't be applicable to a wildlife facility, but if the format or the approach is similar, it may still help the two work seamlessly in concert with each other. Consider which of your partner's plan components are best for you. Some may not be applicable, as we say, but many are good practices. Let's consider some of them. The plan forward. This may include basics about the process, like who assisted or was part of the planning team and so forth. You may include a forward or not in your plan. Authentication. This is a very important part of the plan because it clarifies responsibility and authority. It notes who approved the plan and when. It also reminds you who the key players are and who you may need to approve further changes, future changes, or may have additional input. The record of changes. Well, plans are living documents. They should be reviewed and modified pretty regularly. It should include a note of the changes, when and by whom they were made, and we'll discuss how, when, and why changes might be made in Section 6, Train and Maintain the Plan. Plan distribution. This is just a record of who received a copy, both inside and outside your facility, such as your local fire department chief or animal curators or key staff. This allows tracking of where the plan went and reinforces who are the important leaders in the leadership roles. Introduction and purpose. This clarifies what the goals are and the reasons for those goals. It helps explain why and to what ends is the plan really constructed. Things such as ensuring human safety, ensuring business continuity, endangered species salvation, or whatever motivates you. Those are your purposes and motivation. Situations and assumptions. This part helps you clarify how the planning process was initiated and the assumptions that the plan team made at the time the plan was written. These situations or assumptions can change over time as the infrastructure changes or your collection changes, regional disease status changes, and things like that. Authorities, references, and limitations. Well, they're just that. Under whose authority was it done? What references were used or available? And what are the limitations of the plan and the response? Organization and assignment of responsibility. It describes how is the staff organized and deployed. Who has responsibility for what? Various components of the plan may require different people to have the primary responsibility. Leadership succession. Well, no staff can function 24/7 indefinitely. In longer-term responses and recovery, this portion simply describes the cycling of staff in and out, not just the storm team. Plan maintenance? Well, that describes how, when, and why a plan is to be updated or changed, or whether it's annually or post-event, or whatever's best for your institution. Don't forget that every update should be approved and shared with your critical partners as well. Phone lists. Well, that's self-explanatory, but it may include all types of partners, MOU contacts, potential resource lists, and any contexts that you might deem useful. Maps and floor plans must not just be part of the written document. They should be posted in key locations too, where the public, responders, and staff can have a quick reference. They should be provided to your partners with the plan as well. Responders may be unfamiliar with the structures of your facility. Even staff may be disoriented under some disaster conditions. Building damage, downed trees, flooding, night operations. and alterations to the grounds may even confuse staff orientation. Maps, yes, physical maps, may help everyone in the challenging environment of a disaster. Likewise, physical paper road maps may be best for transportation or evacuation. Victims of disasters often report disorientation due to loss of landmarks or street signs, buildings, and other disaster alterations. Remember, GPS and phone apps and other digital directional media may be inoperable in a disaster for many reasons. Paper maps can be dried and used, but an iPhone, not so much. What memoranda of understanding, mutual aid agreements, and contracts, etc. exist? What are the other pertinent documents that are essential to your plan? Copies of those should be included as well. You decide. These are some of the components that history has taught us are critical in disaster plans for wildlife facilities. Work with your planning partners to determine your critical components. We'll cover these in more detail later in this module. Communications must be considered for both communication into and out of the facility, because both are critical. Administration is all about people and documentation. How will you take care of your response staff, or those who can't get to work? Who will document what's going on in the facility as the response and recovery continues? Data preservation. What data will be preserved, where, when, how often, and who's responsible for doing so? What other backups do you have? How many backups do you need? What needs to be a hard copy backup? Shelter in place or lockdown? Under what circumstances and how will sheltering actually be accomplished? How can it be scaled up or expanded for more serious events? Evacuation. Define under what circumstances will you evacuate people or animals, and how will it be accomplished? In lieu of an EMS mandatory evacuation order, what are the trigger points for animal evacuations or for people? What are the partial evacuation criteria? Facility infrastructure assessment. Pre- and post-event facility assessments will be critical to many aspects of your plan. In fact, infrastructure assessment and documentation in advance may greatly assist with insurance indemnity or FEMA assistance. Safety and security describes what protocols are in place for both pre- and post-events to ensure safety of the people, the animals, and the structures. Every facility has distinctive considerations. The plan should include any other unique considerations as identified in your risk assessment and your needs and limitations. Specific concerns characteristic to your facility, such as overhead tram ride response, other rides, on-grounds housing, and other considerations that only you can identify, should also be included. Animal-specific plan elements. They're your distinct challenge as a wildlife facility. Animal escape response, multiple animal escape protocols, escaped animals you can't find, and numerous special considerations exist that only you can really address. What is the clear plan for the use of lethal force for human protection from animals? And how is it controlled or executed? Animal shelter in place. How, when, where, and for how long may they be sheltered? Animal evacuation. What are the components of a partial or complete collection removal? Define the trigger points for animals to be removed. Infectious disease is very specialized consideration which may require a plan subsection and veterinary expertise, certainly designed with state animal health and USDA input for agricultural diseases. So, let's take some of these plan components one at a time and spend a little more time on them individually by breaking them down, making each measurable, and ensure the plan covers them in sufficient detail to confirm that they can actually be accomplished. Think about your standard operating systems for communication. Will this equipment work in an incident? Consider multiple communication modalities and how they may work or not in a disaster. Intra-facility communication methods vary and usually include some kind of hand radios, but what additional communication modes or equipment will you deploy in disaster? Communication codes, whether that be numbers, alphanumeric, coded phrases, words, or colors, may be useful, but only when necessarily cryptic. Clear, concise, verbal exchanges, as used in the ICS system, minimize the probability of miscommunication. Certainly if no one's listening anyway, codes or cryptic messages are potentially misunderstood even by staff. If codes are to be used, they must be pre-approved with all first responders, such as your police, your fire, EMS, and so forth. You never want your codes to potentially confuse responders who may pick up your communication transmissions too. Ongoing communications from the outside into the institution are critical. EMS evacuation orders, approaching weather systems, river flood levels, environmental contamination, disease updates, evacuations, and warnings are just a few examples. Communications like take shelter may need to be instantaneous. Others may be daily situation reports such as agricultural disease progression or river height elevation. Ensure that you can acquire disaster communications from outside your facility. Television, radios, whether that's AM, FM, shortwave, emergency responder radio or weather radios, the internet, and so forth. Decide how much redundancy you require, but be sure you can get those communications. Dedicated emergency communication availability is essential for business and security, and also for the personal needs of staff. No good parent will be okay with coming to work and being unable to check on their kids in a disaster. Local emergency response communication is critical to maintain in case you need them or provide them with updates on your condition. You need to update your partners regularly and with various ongoing events. Together, you decide how that should be accomplished. Staff is directly impacted by their ability or inability to manage their personal lives in a disaster. And this starts with communication. Child care, family obligations, and other critical communications should be part of the communication plan. Public information dissemination and media management will help your story be told. How will you ensure reliable outside communication in a disaster? Put it in writing. Administrative functions may be compromised, especially long-term facility closures or recovery. What key operational functions must be maintained for your staff support, and how will they be sustained? Administration of payroll, staff scheduling, business operations, and records must be maintained to the extent possible under the circumstances. Every plan should have recovery as a final objective. Plan implementation should support that objective. Staff have personal needs and limitations as well. Being paid is one of them. Parents can't just abandon kids at home in the middle of a disaster to come feed the penguins. Many folks today have elderly parents at home as well. These could be an asset to help with the grandkids or a burden if they aren't physically or mentally capable of being secure alone in a disaster. Even pets in a disaster, likewise, add to the burden on staff and their personal needs. Their families have to come first. Figure out how you can help them by thinking outside the box. One Texas zoo set up a temporary child care facility in their education building because all the schools and daycare were closed due to the disaster. A sample personal disaster jump kit or a check sheet is available in the workbook, and providing your employees with resources like the check sheet to help them to survive or flourish personally may help your facility do the same. Asset documentation is critical to be indemnified, reimbursed, or receive assistance for your losses. After a disaster occurs, it may not even be possible to document the original condition or the value of your losses. Documentation can be in many forms, but hard copy verification of a critical asset may be prudent for many objects. Likewise, loss of those assets must be documented as well. It may not be best to just throw those useless, waterlogged laptops into the dumpster without documenting their damaged condition. If individual animals are valuable and are insured, it may be prudent to contact your insurance agency if possible before even humanely euthanizing the animal. At the very least, urgency to end suffering should be documented. Data preservation is critical to get back in business after an incident. Documentation, both historical and current, is essential to business continuity. What hard copy business documents must be preserved? Land deeds? Titles? Insurance documents? What documents are required for reimbursement, indemnity, or insurance claims? You need to be able to guarantee continued functioning throughout disaster and recovery. Which animal records are essential? Define not only how do you secure them, but how you'll get access to those records during the disaster. Animals, especially CITES species, can't even be moved out of state without proper medical and acquisition records. You need to make those determinations for your facility. A critical plan component should be in the plan for sheltering humans in place and to protect them in any incident. Before deciding how and where to shelter people, it's best to consult your local emergency responders to identify the best temporary shelter locations, both inside your facility and potential evacuation sheltering locations. It's a good idea to have written information for the short-term disaster assets, resources, maps, and protocols available actually inside the shelter itself as well. Leaving may be the first and best choice if human life is threatened. Animal evacuation is protection of property and follows human safety and situation stabilization. Only after 1, people are safe, and 2, the situation is stable, can you consider animal evacuation or care. Emergency responders or law enforcement may mandate evacuation with floods, toxins, hazmats, fires, active shooters, and things like that. With some toxins like chlorine spills, there may be time for nothing but human escape to avoid this lethal chemical exposure. Follow your EMS instructions. Define under what circumstances your plan includes human evacuation rather than sheltering in place. You should define your regroup or rally destination as well if you must escape. This might be an escape group shelter site or just home arrival confirmation. But identify the check-in communication protocol, by whom and how it's to be done. With a mandatory human evacuation, what will be done for the animals? Well, this will be incident dependent, but these topics should be discussed during the risk assessment phase of your planning. Don't forget, you'll need to identify what you need to respond to these time-sensitive events in your plan. Some events may provide only minutes of warning, others may be days. The more preparations that can be made pre-event, the better. Decide what can be done in advance and who is responsible to see each task is completed. Post-event, someone must also be responsible, trained, and capable of deciding whether to report on-site problems to the appropriate entity, such as the electric company, gas company, or whoever. Someone must be designated to be in charge of checking the fuel, electric, fuel storage, and such. Make sure your plan includes who is responsible for these critical actions during an incident. Because the entire local infrastructure may require assistance, the repair and evaluation crews may be stretched very thin. A knowledgeable staff member must make the initial situation report and decide whether outside assistance should be requested. Staff with expertise must confer with a safety officer to ensure conditions are safe or whether to halt operations until utility companies can respond. Knowledgeable staff are your first line of defense. Structural condition of buildings, enclosure integrity for animals, electrical systems and generators, aquarium filters and pumps, vehicle viability or fuel storage integrity, HVAC, climate control, and debris assessment are just some of these to consider. Remember, the phone list, part of the plan, should include communication information for every entity that may require contact. Include the utilities, specific contact people if possible, and of course, your emergency managers. Defining who is in charge of which assessment should be clear and based on individual skill set or expertise. Additional caveats or conditions to the process may also need to be identified as well. For example, a trained electrical facility staffer may be required to evaluate the reptile house, but in case venomous animals have escaped, a reptile keeper may be required to accompany them. Define which enclosures are most vulnerable based on the disaster types in your plan. For some examples, wooden buildings in a wildfire, or aviaries in the wind, maybe moats and pools in floods, aquaria in electrical interruption, or generators in saltwater inundation. Animal structural vulnerability evaluation templates are available in the workbook. Define who assesses the damage and make sure that your plan states who determines the safety of the enclosures following an incident. Identify which enclosures are the most vulnerable to your likely events and prescribe what likely repair materials or corrective measures may be required, such as fence panels for hoof stock for temporary enclosure repair, or nylon netting for temporary aviary covering, and all those types of things. Decide what repair or mitigation resources may be needed for each structure. Utilize your partners to identify the safety and security concerns. Security risks vary by community, and your partners will help you figure out your vulnerabilities as well as solutions. A large inner-city zoo may have very different concerns than a drive-through wildlife park in the rural Midwest. Likewise, solutions may be distinctive to each facility as well. Some facilities may already use commercial security companies in normal circumstances that might be ramped up to 24-hour assistance in disaster. A city-owned zoo might have access to city police department resources. During the incident response and recovery phases, humans and animals alike may inundate a facility for numerous reasons. Uninvited guests may simply be seeking high ground in a flood, or may be displaced by approaching fire, or they may enter with malicious intent. But do prepare for animal and public influx. Work with your police force and your security team to develop a 24-hour security plan. Identify your security priorities for both human and animal-related safety. The public may be already on grounds, or other people may be disaster victims, disoriented, lost, or individuals simply seeking assistance. Others may have disreputable intent, or even pose a mortal threat to staff or visitors or animals. Disasters bring out the best and the worst in people. What additional security will be utilized for animal holding in disasters? How will native wildlife be dealt with following a disaster? If you develop a storm rider team, they will need special planning elements to ensure they can do the job. Your storm rider team may be autonomous for an extended period of time. Even if relief staff arrive, local infrastructure may still not be available for an extended period. Food and water are the most obvious minimum requirements. However, predicting waste management and those requirements may be equally critical. Sewage may be erupting from the toilets in a flood. In lieu of outside infrastructure function, human waste, animal waste, and generic trash may require alternative management. In the short term, some form of temporary holding might be used, whether that be porta potties, dump trucks for animal waste, or enclosure just to secure human trash. Likewise, staff hygiene is also essential to consider, especially if they must remain on site for several consecutive days. Predict the laundry and sanitary requirements for at least a small team footprint. You can see in the workbook for more information on Storm Rider team preparedness. Only you know your animal collection particularities and vulnerabilities. The disaster preparation response challenges faced by wildlife facilities is exponential compared to most other enterprises. But this is your area of expertise, and no one can do it for you or do it better. So, what is the objective here? Preserve property. Each institution must identify the most critical individual specimens to protect, herds of hoof stock, gaggles of Hawaiian geese, or murder of endangered crows, whether to shelter or to evacuate, for their own individual safety or for the conservation of the species. Each facility collection is unique, and therefore the criteria for animal salvation are equally unique. What other criteria might a facility use? Well, how about Smokey the neutered bear mascot? How about a public favorite celebrity education animal? Maybe a neonate that was recently broadly publicized. Maybe Puxatawny Phil II. What about the difficulty in transport? How long will it take to train a giraffe to enter a transport vehicle, or to obtain a hippo transport container? These challenges must factor in to who is evacuated early as well. We must know what to do if an animal escapes at our facilities, or escapes from the facility property. Multiple simultaneous escapes may occur in disasters. A scalable or simultaneous capture capability may be required. Standard escape protocols may need to be ramped up where they're possible. They should be consistent with standard operating protocols with which the staff is already familiar. Develop and share your escape protocols with the first responders. They need to know what you can do, what you will do, and what you will not do. They must understand the staff roles, Who's responsible for what? What are the staff capabilities? Who will meet them at the gate and respond to an escape? Responders must know when it is beyond staff capabilities as well. When will control be given or taken away from the institution and given to responders or law enforcement? Once animals escape the perimeter fence? Once someone has been injured or killed by an animal? With infectious disease, at what point will USDA take control of the animals that may be placing agricultural animals at risk? Once a single bird at the zoo tests positive for avian influenza? At the first lesion that might be foot and mouth disease on a children's zoo goat? Work with your partners to identify those turning points in control within your plan. This is important. Define this policy well. Make sure your plans detail the use of lethal force. You may have a policy of no lethal force allowed. Maybe if your facility is a small aquarium or there are no dangerous collection animals. However, you may still need to consider personnel safety from other people in an incident. Make a clear and unequivocal policy on the use and authorization of lethal force. Specifically, for violent armed criminals. There must be consensus between the facility and the police, sheriff, or other jurisdictional authority on what is the appropriate use of lethal force, including training requirements, licensure, and other things. First responders, especially law enforcement, must know which personnel have authorization and direct access to institutional firearms and ammunition. No one? Everyone? They need to know what they're walking into, so no one gets shot accidentally. Who can approve personal protection firearms and under what circumstances? Caretakers of carnivores with escape potential? Veterinary staff? Animal sheltering requires staff sheltering and continuity first, as well as animal care, potable water, environment, and water quality control. In an infectious agricultural animal epidemic or epizootic, animal feces and bedding, every ounce of animal waste may be under strict USDA control and may not even be allowed to leave the facility. Identify temporary storage locations or processing options with the USDA should the bedding, feces, and possibly dead animals be restricted to remain on the property until cleared by USDA and or decontaminated. Identify alternative equipment that can be used in disasters to ensure animal care. For long-term recovery, you can obtain a refrigerated truck for perishables, but don't forget the fuel for the truck. An elevated shipping container above high water mark may be used for dry goods. Maybe just an MOU with a local secure storage vendor will suffice in some disasters. Remember, the animal food acquisition chain may be disrupted or main roads may be impassable. Can staff be recruited as transporters as they were for the zoo in Katrina? What's your protocol without the regular delivery service? With whom may MOUs be created to assist with disaster food acquisition or temporary storage of the food? It may be useful to consider a more distant vendor as well. The local folks and local source may be in the same disaster situation as you are, thus unable to assist you. One farther away may be spared and still functioning. Are alternative foods available as a viable option? Maybe it's just for short-term care? Consider pet foods for related species like dog and cat foods. Cracked corn may not be nutritionally complete, but for short-term survival of endangered pigeons, it may be quite practical. Domestic animal food vendors provided for many pet rescue facilities in Katrina. Can they provide canine kibble for carnivores in a disaster? Animal evacuation is a complicated process that may not even be possible, despite the best planning efforts. Aquatic animals may be impossible to relocate rapidly and safely. This is one area of response in which a small facility may have a huge advantage over a large budget, large collection facility. Most facilities only keep a moderate volume of immobilization drugs under normal circumstances. Plan for acquisition of sufficient immobilization pharmaceuticals for the entire collection to be on site or readily available by some pre-existing agreement. Define additional veterinary, pharmaceutical, or immobilization equipment that you may require, or how quickly can you get it. Consider what other immobilization criteria you must consider for a large-scale evacuation. For an evacuation to be successful, you must identify where Every animal may be temporarily relocated. What potential options exist? It may require multiple holding locations or wildlife facility partners. With whom may MOUs be signed that could bring vehicles and trailers for animal evacuation? Look around your community and your planning partners for options, but consider more distant options in case local options are also under the disaster conditions. Remember Module 4, where we discuss needs and limitations? What other transportation requirements or equipment are critical to have on site or available for your facility to evacuate? Very few facilities have crates or transport cages sufficient to relocate an entire troop of macaques all at once. Define what else is required to support the effort. Trucks may be useless if you can't fill up the tanks at the local service station that you normally use. Describe the animal transport requirements, the things that may be needed en route as well, like food, water, and environmental control. Sometimes you need to think outside the crate. What other vehicles or transport options may have to be recruited or employed? Define which animals might use domestic hoofstock transportation trucks. Swine shipping trucks are very strong and are well ventilated, structurally sufficient for even many carnivores. It is critical that the veterinary requirements for evacuation or transport are addressed in advance. Measurable. How much is required to do large numbers of animals rapidly? Put it in your plan. Very few facilities maintain drugs and equipment for large-scale immobilization. Don't forget, CO2 rifles require CO2. Some darts are one-use only disposable darts. How many will you need? How many more extra for when shots are missed or it requires additional dosing? MOUs or contracts signed well in advance of an event can ensure you have the outside support you may require. In the middle of disaster, it may be too late to seek outside assistance. Inclusion of approved and signed agreements in the plan can make return to business continuity possible. Possibly, hard copies should be available as well. No facility wants to evacuate its animals, but history has demonstrated over and over that sometimes it's the only viable option. Collections have been decimated because the institution was unable or unwilling to evacuate. But fear not, history has also taught us that it can be done effectively and successfully. It's also an area where you can acquire help and input from your sister institutions and their lessons learned. Wildlife facility plans should always prepare for infectious agricultural animal disease outbreaks. Use your state and USDA partners to identify the diseases and the species at most risk in your unique collection. Depending on the disease and your species, your standard operating procedures may not be enough to protect your collection in an outbreak. State animal health officials have jurisdiction over foreign animal diseases in your state. Consult them to ensure your plans comply with theirs. State officials are supported by the USDA. Your planning team should include them both. Their plans should include your unique needs and capabilities as well. Because of the massive national economic and human health impacts of foreign animal diseases, decisions concerning your collection may be made at the highest regulatory authority and may be out of your control. Every facility has biosecurity deficits and limitations. What are some of yours? Do you have porous caging materials like wood, branches, and substrate that can't be disinfected? You may be able to change, mitigate, or compensate for some of those vulnerabilities, but how you intend to compensate for those challenges should be in your plan. Do you have a scalable, standard biosecurity operating procedure? In a disease outbreak, these may require expansion or intensification or even initiation of new protocols. How to increase disease surveillance. Biosecurity and diagnostic protocols will be based on a specific disease. Enhanced vector control and other ways to limit transmission are keys to biosecurity. The actions you intend to take to mitigate disease exposure must be based on how transmission of a specific disease actually occurs, and that must be included in your plan. Your partners helped you identify the resources they bring to the table and how to integrate your plan with theirs. Hopefully, your risk assessment and needs list came in handy for guiding your plan direction and goals. Now that you have the plan, it's time to start training. Ready to move on to making your plan come to life? Let's go!